Welcome to the mental grand. I sat at my parents' dining table, the same oak table where I'd eaten thousands of meals, celebrated birthdays, shared dreams. My mother slid a manila envelope across the wood toward me with trembling hands. My father wouldn't even look at me. Inside were disownment papers, legal documents declaring I was no longer their son. My younger brother Derek smirked from across the table, his wife Jessica touching his arm with false sympathy. They wanted me erased. What they didn't know was that I had my own envelope in my briefcase, and inside it was a $7 million contract that would change everything they thought they knew about me. Let me take you back 6 months. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm 48 years old. I worked my entire adult life in commercial real estate development, starting from the absolute bottom. While my brother Derek went to an Ivy League school on my parents' dime, I took out loans for state college and worked 3 jobs to pay my way through. My parents always had a favorite, and it wasn't me. Derek was the golden child, charismatic, charming, always knew how to work a room. I was the quiet one, the worker, the one who kept my head down and got things done without fanfare. My parents owned a successful printing business in Ohio. Nothing massive, but comfortable. They'd built a nice life, a beautiful home in the suburbs, respect in the community. When Derek graduated, they brought him into the business immediately, gave him a VP title he hadn't earned. When I graduated, my father shook my hand and told me it was time I made my own way. I wasn't bitter then. I understood. Derek had that spark, that personality. I was just Marcus, reliable but unremarkable in their eyes. I moved to Chicago and started working for a commercial development firm. Entry level, cold calls, property research, endless grunt work. But I learned everything. I studied every deal, every negotiation, every contract. I watched the senior developers and absorbed their strategies like a sponge. At night, I took courses in property law, financing, architectural planning. I dated rarely, had few friends, lived in a tiny apartment. My entire life was building toward something, though I didn't quite know what yet. That's when I realized they had no idea who they were messing with. Years passed. I climbed slowly but steadily. Associate, junior developer, project manager. I specialized in transforming neglected urban properties into mixed-use developments, shopping, residential, office space. It was an art and a science, and I was getting good at it, really good. My projects came in on budget and on time. Investors started requesting me specifically. By my late 30s, I was a senior developer with a reputation for turning struggling properties into gold mines. Meanwhile, Derek was running my parents' printing business into the ground. This wasn't immediately obvious to them because Derek was a master at presentation. He'd show them glossy reports, talk about strategic pivots and market repositioning. But the numbers were bleeding. Contracts were being lost. Longtime clients were walking away. The business my parents had spent 30 years building was dying, and Derek was too proud or too incompetent to stop it. I visited home maybe twice a year, Thanksgiving and Christmas usually. The conversations were always the same. My mother would ask about my work with polite disinterest. My father would grunt acknowledgement. Then they'd spend hours talking about Derek's vision for the company, his innovative strategies. Jessica, Derek's wife, would sit there nodding along, playing the supportive spouse. I'd smile, eat my turkey, and leave as soon as politely possible. 3 years ago, my parents made Derek the sole heir to their estate. They didn't tell me directly. I found out when my mother accidentally mentioned the paperwork during a phone call. When I asked what paperwork, there was an uncomfortable silence. Then she explained, almost defensively, that Derek was running the family business, so it made sense he'd inherit everything. The house, the business, their savings, all of it. I'd be fine, she said. I had my own career. What happened next changed everything. I didn't argue, I didn't protest. I said I understood and got off the phone. Then I sat in my Chicago apartment looking out at the city lights and made a decision. I was done waiting for their approval. I was done being the overlooked son. I was going to build something so undeniable that one day they'd realize exactly what they dismissed. I left the firm where I'd worked for 15 years and started my own development company, Chen Property Development. It was terrifying. I'd saved aggressively, lived below my means, and had enough for startup costs, but barely. I brought in a former colleague, Patricia, as my partner. She was brilliant with financing and had connections I didn't. We started small, a strip mall renovation in a struggling neighborhood. We finished under budget and leased every unit within 3 months. Then a small apartment building conversion. Then a larger mixed-use project. Word spread fast in the development world. We didn't just renovate buildings, we revitalized entire blocks. We worked with city planners, community organizations, local businesses. Our projects improved neighborhoods, created jobs, increased property values for everyone around us. Within 2 years, we were fielding offers from major investors. Within 3 years, we'd completed 12 projects across the Midwest, all successful. Chen Property Development was becoming a name people knew. My parents had no idea. I didn't tell them. Why would I? They'd never asked about the details of my work. During my brief holiday visits, they were too busy talking about Derek's latest brilliant idea for the printing business. I'd learned to just smile and nod. But I watched Derek carefully during those visits, saw the stress lines around his eyes, noticed how he drank more than he used to, caught the moments when Jessica would shoot him worried looks that he'd pretend not to see. That's when I realized they had no idea what was coming. Last year, I got the call that would change everything. A major national development firm, Westbridge Properties, wanted to acquire Chen Property Development. They'd been watching our work, and they were impressed. Not just impressed, they were offering a partnership deal that was almost unheard of for a company our size. They wanted our expertise, our methodology, our track record, and they were willing to pay handsomely for it. The negotiations took months. My Patricia and I worked with lawyers, accountants, advisors. Westbridge wanted to bring us in as a subsidiary with full operational independence. We'd keep the Chen name, keep our team, keep our approach. They'd provide capital, resources, and access to projects we could never tackle alone. In exchange, they'd acquire 70% ownership, and Patricia and I would retain 30%, plus guaranteed positions as executive directors with full profit participation. The numbers were staggering. The initial acquisition payment was $7 million, split between Patricia and I, based on our ownership percentages. I'd walk away with $4.2 million immediately. But the real value was in the ongoing arrangement. Conservative projections had my annual income jumping to somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million, with potential for much more as we scaled up. At 48 years old, after decades of grinding, I'd made it. Really made it. I didn't tell my parents yet. I wanted to see them first, see Derek, understand what was really happening with the family business. Something told me the timing mattered. So I scheduled a visit home to Ohio, told my mother I was coming through for business and would love to have dinner. She seemed surprised, but pleased. When I arrived at their house that Friday evening, I immediately sensed something was off. My father looked older, more tired than I'd ever seen him. My mother was nervously fussing with dishes in the kitchen. Derek and Jessica were already there, sitting in the living room like they owned the place, which I suppose they essentially did. Derek's greeting was cold, perfunctory. Jessica didn't even look up from her phone. The whole atmosphere felt heavy, conspiratorial. What happened next changed everything. We sat down for dinner, and the small talk was painful. My mother asked about Chicago, and I gave vague, positive answers. My father asked if I was still doing that property thing, and I said yes. Derek didn't ask me anything. He just kept exchanging looks with Jessica and our parents. Finally, as we were finishing the main course, my father cleared his throat. He gave a little speech about family, about difficult decisions, about doing what was necessary for the future. I sat there, listening, watching Derek's barely concealed satisfaction. Then my mother, with tears in her eyes, slid that manila envelope across the table to me. She told me to open it. Inside were legal documents, disownment papers, formal paperwork legally severing my relationship as their son. I stared at the papers, genuinely shocked, despite everything. My mother was crying now, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. My father still wouldn't meet my gaze. I looked at Derek, and he actually smiled, a small, cold smile that told me everything I needed to know about who was really behind this. I asked the obvious question, why? What had I done to deserve this? Derek leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. He explained with false sympathy that the family had discussed it extensively. They felt I distanced myself from them over the years. I barely visited, barely called, showed no interest in the family business or legacy. Meanwhile, Derek had dedicated his life to continuing what our parents built. He and Jessica were planning to have children soon, the next generation. They needed to think about consolidation, about keeping everything unified under one family line. The financial reasoning was barely hidden under the surface. Derek needed money. The business was failing, though he'd never admit it. Contracts were being lost. Long-time clients were walking away. The business my parents had spent 30 years building was dying, and Derek was too proud or too incompetent to stop it. I pulled my own envelope from my briefcase. It was thicker than theirs. I placed it on the table in front of me and looked at each of them in turn. My father, still avoiding eye contact, my mother, confused now, Jessica, irritated at the interruption, and Derek, whose smile was starting to fade as he realized I wasn't reacting the way he'd expected. I told them I had something to share too, something I'd been planning to tell them this weekend anyway, though the timing was now more interesting than I'd anticipated. I opened my envelope and removed the contract, the Westbridge Properties Acquisition Agreement, signed, finalized, effective in 2 weeks. I slid it across the table, right next to their disownment papers. The room went silent. My mother picked up the first page, her hands shaking. My father finally looked at me, then at the papers, his face draining of color. Derek lunged forward, grabbing the contract and scanning through it rapidly. I watched him find the numbers. His face went white, then red. Jessica was reading over his shoulder, her mouth falling open. What happened next was beautiful in its simplicity. I explained, in the same calm tone they'd used with me, that I'd built a commercial real estate development company from nothing, that we'd completed multiple successful projects across the Midwest, that Westbridge Properties, one of the largest development firms in the nation, had acquired my company for a $7 million initial payment, plus ongoing profit participation that would generate somewhere around $1 million annually for me going forward. My mother made a small sound, almost a gasp. My father was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Derek's hands were clenching the contract so hard the paper was wrinkling. I continued, telling them about my position as executive director, about the projects we'd be working on, about the reputation I'd built. Everything they'd never asked about, never cared to know, the career they dismissed as that property thing. That's when I realized they finally understood what they'd done. I told them it was fine, actually. The disownment papers were probably for the best. They were right. I had distanced myself. Not because I didn't care about family, but because they'd made it clear years ago that I wasn't really part of their vision for the future. Derek was their legacy, their hope, their focus. I was just Marcus, the other son, the one who quietly left and made his own way. I stood up from the table. I told them I'd signed their disownment papers. I'd have my lawyer review them, make sure everything was legally sound, and I'd sign. They could have their unified family legacy. Derek could inherit everything without complication. The failing printing business, the house with its mortgage, their savings that had been depleted keeping the business afloat. All his. I wanted no part of it. My mother started crying harder, saying that wasn't what she meant, that I was misunderstanding. My father finally found his voice, saying we should talk about this, not make hasty decisions. But Derek, his face purple with rage and humiliation, told them to let me go. He said I'd clearly only come here to show off, to make them feel small, that I'd never really been part of the family anyway. I looked at Derek for a long moment. I told him he was right about one thing. I wasn't part of this family, but not because I didn't want to be, because they spent my entire life making sure I knew I was second choice, second priority, second in everything. While he got opportunities handed to him, I built my own. While he coasted on their support, I worked 3 jobs to put myself through school. While he ran their business into the ground with ego and incompetence, I created something real and valuable from nothing. What happened next changed everything forever. Jessica, who'd been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. She said I was being cruel, that I was jealous of Derek, that I'd always been jealous. She said the disownment was probably a good idea because I was clearly toxic and bitter, that Derek had been protecting them from me for years, trying to shield them from my resentment. I smiled at that. I actually smiled because Jessica was revealing something important. This whole thing, the disownment, the timing, the legal papers, it all had Derek's fingerprints on it. He'd orchestrated this. He'd convinced our elderly parents that cutting me out legally was necessary, probably framing it as protecting the family assets, protecting them. And they'd gone along with it because they'd always gone along with whatever Derek wanted. I asked Derek directly how much debt the printing business was carrying. He tried to deflect, said it wasn't relevant. I pressed. I told him I knew he was drowning, that the company was probably 6 months from bankruptcy, maybe less, that he'd been leveraging my parents' personal assets to keep it afloat, that this disownment was really about making sure I couldn't interfere when he started selling off their property, their house, everything they owned, to cover his failures. My father's face told me I was right. He looked at Derek with something like horror. My mother's crying had stopped, and she was looking at her golden child with dawning realization. Derek started blustering, accusing me of making things up, of trying to turn them against him. But the energy had shifted. The truth was out there now, hanging in the air like smoke. That's when I realized I'd won without even trying. I told them I'd be leaving now. I'd have my lawyer contact them about the disownment papers. I suggested they might want to have their own lawyer, someone independent, review their financial situation and Derek's management of their business, just to make sure they understood what they were really signing away. I picked up my briefcase, leaving the Westbridge contract on the table for them to contemplate. My mother reached for me, calling my name. I paused at the doorway. She said she was sorry, that they'd made a mistake, that we should talk about this. I told her we'd just had the only conversation we needed to have. They'd made their choice years ago. Tonight, they'd just made it official with paperwork. The only difference was that now they knew what that choice actually cost them. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. I drove to my hotel and slept better than I had in years. The next morning, I flew back to Chicago. My lawyer did review the disownment papers. They were legal, if unusual. Essentially, my parents were omitting me from their will, from any family trusts, and declaring in legal terms that I was no longer considered their heir or dependent. My lawyer said I didn't have to sign, that I could contest. I told him to prepare a counter document. What happened next was the sweetest revenge of all. Instead of just signing their disownment papers, my lawyer drew up a comprehensive legal separation agreement. It formally acknowledged the disownment, agreed to remove me from all inheritance claims, but also included clauses that permanently barred my parents from making any future financial or legal claims against me or my assets. It prevented them from using my name or reputation in any business dealings, and it included a detailed accounting of every loan, every dollar they'd given Derek versus what they'd given me over the years. The difference was staggering. Over $200,000 in support for Derek versus maybe $15,000 for me, mostly student loan co-signing that I'd fully repaid. The document made it clear. They wanted to disown me, fine, but it would be complete and permanent. They would have no claim to my success, no ability to ask for help when Derek's failures caught up with them, no reconnection when it became convenient. My lawyer sent it to them with a simple note: sign this version or I contest the original, and we go to court where all of this becomes public record. They signed, both versions. It took 3 weeks, and my mother called twice during that time, crying, trying to explain, trying to walk it back. I didn't answer. My father sent an email, stiff and formal, saying they hoped I'd reconsider. I didn't respond. Derek sent nothing, which told me everything. He'd gotten what he wanted, or thought he had. The family assets were his, no complications, no shared inheritance. He could leverage, sell, destroy it all without anyone stopping him. That's when I realized the real revenge wasn't what I did, it was what I didn't do. 2 months after the disownment was finalized, the Westbridge acquisition completed. The money hit my account. $4.2 million. My new position started, and with it came the resources of a major national firm. Patricia and I began working on projects that would have been impossible before: a mixed-use development in downtown Cleveland, a waterfront renovation project in Milwaukee, a historic building conversion in Indianapolis, each one bigger and more prestigious than anything we'd done before. The business press noticed: local papers, trade magazines, industry newsletters. Chen Property Development was being featured as a success story: young company, innovative approach, major acquisition, bright future. My name started appearing in articles, on panels, and interviews, not because I sought attention, but because the work spoke for itself. The local Ohio Business Journal ran a feature. I didn't know if my parents saw it, but I knew their friends would have, their neighbors, their business associates. Meanwhile, Derek's printing company officially filed for bankruptcy 6 months after our dinner. It made the local news because my parents' business had been a fixture in the community. The story mentioned how the company had struggled under new management, how contracts had been lost, how modernization efforts had failed. Derek was named specifically as the president who'd overseen the decline. My parents weren't mentioned much, but everyone in their community would know, would talk, would wonder how the Chen family business had fallen so far. What happened next was predictable, but still satisfying. My parents had to sell their house, the one Derek was supposed to inherit, the family home. It went to cover business debts that Derek had personally guaranteed, using their property as collateral. They moved into a small condo, retirement community style. My mother's friends would know what that meant: the downsize, the forced sale, the quiet admission of financial disaster. Derek and Jessica divorced within a year. I heard this through the grapevine, former neighbors who still had my email. Apparently, the stress of the bankruptcy, the loss of status, the failure, it destroyed their marriage. Jessica left him, took what little remained, moved back to her home state. Derek ended up managing a print shop for someone else. Entry-level work, the kind I'd started with in real estate decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents never reached out directly, but I heard they told people that we'd had a falling out over business matters, that I'd become too focused on money and success to value family. The narrative they built was self-protective, making me the villain of the story. I didn't correct it. I didn't need to. Anyone who knew the real story, who saw what happened to Derek, who understood the timeline, they could draw their own conclusions. That's when I realized revenge isn't about making others suffer. It's about building something so successful that their rejection becomes irrelevant. I didn't destroy Derek. He destroyed himself with entitlement and incompetence. I didn't humiliate my parents. They made their choice and lived with consequences. I just refused to be pulled down with them. I just kept building, kept growing, kept succeeding without them. Chen Property Development continued to expand. Within 2 years of the Westbridge acquisition, we'd completed projects in 8 states. My personal income exceeded projections. The 30% ownership stake I'd retained became worth more than the initial acquisition payment as the subsidiary grew. I was financially secure for life. More than secure, I was wealthy. And I'd done it entirely on my own terms, without family support or connections. I met someone, Catherine, an architect I worked with on a Cleveland project. She was brilliant, funny, understood the work because she lived it too. We dated for a year before I told her about my family, about the disownment, about everything. She listened without judgment, then said something that changed my perspective. She said some people are born into families that support them, and some people have to build their own families from scratch. That neither approach is wrong, there's just different paths to the same destination, finding people who value you. We got married last spring. Small ceremony, just close friends and colleagues. Patricia was my best woman, if that's even what you call it. Catherine's family welcomed me warmly, and her father told me he admired what I'd built, not just the business, the life. The character it took to walk away from people who didn't appreciate you and still maintain your dignity. I realized he was right. The hardest part hadn't been the disownment itself. It had been maintaining my self-respect throughout it, not becoming bitter or angry, just focused and determined. What happened next surprised even me. About 6 months ago, I got a letter, handwritten, from my mother. It was forwarded through my lawyer since they didn't have my current address. She wrote about regrets, about mistakes, about how they'd been manipulated by Derek, though she took responsibility too. She said my father's health was declining, that they thought about me often, that they were proud of what I'd accomplished, even if they had no right to be. She asked not for forgiveness, but for understanding, for maybe one conversation before it was too late. I sat with that letter for weeks. Catherine said the choice was mine, that she'd support whatever I decided. Patricia said to be careful, that some wounds don't need reopening. My lawyer advised maintaining the legal separation regardless. I thought about that dinner table, those disownment papers, Derek's smirk. But I also thought about being 48 years old, successful, happy, secure, and I realized something important. That's when I realized that holding on to anger was giving them power they didn't deserve anymore. I called my mother. We talked for 2 hours. She cried. I didn't. She explained things, and I listened. My father got on the phone toward the end, his voice weaker than I remembered. He said he was sorry, that he'd been a fool, that he'd let Derek manipulate him because it was easier than admitting his favorite son was failing, that he should have seen my worth years ago. I told him I appreciated the apology. I told them both that I understood how it happened, even if I didn't agree with it. But I also told them the truth. We couldn't go back. The disownment was final, and I wanted it that way. They'd made their choice, and I made mine. I'd built a good life without them, and I didn't need to undo that for a reconciliation that might make them feel better but wouldn't change anything fundamental. But I told them I'd visit, once. I'd come to Ohio and have dinner with them, talk with them, let them see who I'd become, not because I needed their approval anymore, but because they needed to understand what they'd given up, what choosing Derek over me actually cost. Not in money, though that was part of it, but in relationship, in knowing their son, in being part of something real and earned rather than entitled and given. I made that visit last month, Thanksgiving actually. Their condo was small but comfortable. My father looked frail and my mother looked older. We sat around a much smaller table and ate a much simpler meal. I told them about my work, about Catherine, about my life. They listened with something like wonder, like I was a stranger telling an incredible story rather than their son sharing his reality. My father asked if I was happy. I told him I was, truly happy, not just successful. I'd found work that mattered, a partner who valued me, friends who respected me, a life built on my own terms. He nodded slowly, and I saw tears in his eyes. He said that was all a father could want for his son. I didn't point out the irony of that statement. I just let it sit there between us. My mother asked if I'd ever forgive them. I thought about that carefully before answering. I told her forgiveness wasn't really the right word for what I felt. I understood why things happened the way they did. I didn't carry anger anymore. But I also didn't need them in my life in any significant way. They were people I used to know, people connected to me by biology, but not by choice. I wished them well, hoped my father's health improved, hoped they found peace. But we weren't family, not in any meaningful sense. That bridge had been burned completely, and neither side had the materials to rebuild it. What happened next was the final chapter. As I was leaving, my mother gave me a small envelope. Inside was a check. Not for much, maybe $5,000. She said it was from selling some jewelry, that she wanted me to have it, to know they thought of me. I looked at that check for a long moment. $5,000. Less than I spent on Catherine's engagement ring. A fraction of what they'd given Derek over the years. A tiny gesture meant to somehow balance decades of favoritism and rejection. I handed it back. I told her I didn't need their money, never had. What I needed was their belief, their support, their respect. The things you can't buy or give retroactively. I said they should keep the money, use it for my father's medical care or their living expenses. I was fine, better than fine. I'd made my own way, and that was worth more than any check they could write. That's when I realized the story had come full circle. I walked out of that condo the same way I'd walked out of their house the night they gave me the disownment papers. But this time, I wasn't angry or hurt. I was just free. free from needing their approval, their validation, their place in a family hierarchy that never valued me properly. I'd proven everything I needed to prove, not to them, but to myself. The drive back to Chicago was peaceful. Catherine called to check in, and I told her it had gone fine, that I'd gotten closure, the real kind, the kind that comes from truly letting go rather than pretending to. She said she was proud of me, and I realized that mattered more than anything my parents could say. Her pride, Patricia's respect, the esteem of colleagues and friends I'd earned through work and character. That was my real family now. This story isn't really about revenge, though it might look that way from the outside. It's about dignity, about refusing to let other people's judgment define your worth, about building something real when the easy path is closed to you. My parents handed me disownment papers at dinner, trying to erase me from their legacy. I slid my $7 million contract across the table, showing them I'd already built my own. But the contract wasn't the revenge. The success wasn't the payback. The real victory was simpler and more profound. It was holding on to my self-respect through everything. It was refusing to become bitter or cruel. It was building a good life without them, and then having the strength to face them without needing them to acknowledge what they'd lost. That's the kind of revenge that actually satisfies. The kind that comes from knowing you did it right, even when nobody was watching, even when nobody believed in you. To everyone watching this on the mental grand, especially those over 40 who've dealt with family betrayal or being underestimated, here's what I want you to understand. Your value isn't determined by people who can't see it, even if those people are your parents or siblings. When someone shows you they don't value you, believe them the first time. Don't wait for disownment papers or official rejections. Just quietly, with dignity, build something they can't touch or diminish. Build it so well that their rejection becomes irrelevant. And when they realize their mistake, and they will realize it eventually, you don't have to forgive them. You don't have to welcome them back. You don't have to pretend it didn't hurt or didn't matter. You just have to be free from needing their validation. That's the real power reversal. Not making them suffer, but transcending their ability to affect you at all. That's justice. That's dignity. That's winning. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked or dismissed by family, please hit that like button. Share this in the comments. Tell me your story. And subscribe to The Mental Grand for more stories about justice, dignity, and the quiet power of refusing to accept other people's limitations. Thank you for watching. Remember, respect isn't given, it's earned. And sometimes the greatest achievement is earn your own respect by living with integrity when nobody's looking. Take care of yourselves and know that your worth isn't determined by anyone else's blindness to it.